This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez, our guest, Jonathan Steele, former Moscow correspondent for The Guardian. He's with us from London. Anton Chekhovtsov is a Ukrainian citizen from the University College London, researching far-right movements. And here in New York, Keith Gesson, editor at N+1 magazine. Juan?
Well, Jonathan Steele, I'd like to ask you, you mentioned about this leaked phone call. During the protests that ousted the elected president, there were obviously not only protesters killed, but police killed as well. And this leaked tape that has come out has bolstered claims by that anti-government forces were behind sniper attacks on protesters in Kiev last month. Both sides of Ukraine's political divide blamed the other when dozens of people were killed by gunfire in the weeks before the ouster of President Viktor Yanukovych. But in an intercepted phone call between Estonia's Foreign Minister Urmas Paet and the European Union policy chief Catherine Ashton, Paet says the sniper fire came from the opposition.
All the evidence shows that people who were killed by snipers from both sides, among policemen and people from the streets, that they were the same snipers killing people from both sides.
Well,
So that, and then she also showed me some photos. She said that has medical doctor. She can, say that it is the same handwriting, the same type of bullets, and it's really disturbing that now the new coalition that they don't want to investigate what exactly happened, so that there is now stronger and stronger understanding that behind snipers it was not Yanukovych, but it was somebody from the new coalition.
Jonathan Steele, what about this whole issue of the democratic forces that ousted Yanukovych?
Well, I think it was a huge coalition that was in the street in the Maidan Square for several weeks. I mean, of course, there were a lot of ordinary people one could call civilians who were in favor of joining the EU and having the EU agreement, which Yanukovych refused to sign. But then I think there were professional demonstrators, if you like, people who were very experienced in, setting up the tents, providing equipment, providing heating, providing water, food, and so on. And then I think there were people who were insurrectionists who were armed, and in fact some of them might even be called terrorists. I mean, I always thought that it was quite possible that the snipers were coming from the opposition side, because of the first day when there was killing, out of the 28 people dead, 9 were police. I mean, it's not normal in these demonstrations when one side opens fire and it's usually the police, that 9 of their own people die. So one was always suspicious at the beginning. But from this phone call that you just played, it seems that almost all the snipers were from the opposition side, which is a terrible indictment of their behavior, and also of most of the foreign media, which have completely suppressed this phone call, and of Western governments who've made no reference to it. I mean, to their credit, the new authorities in Kiev claim that they're going to have an investigation of the sniper issue. But I've not heard John Kerry or David Cameron coming out publicly and saying that's a very good idea and these are very disturbing suggestions.
Anton Chekhovtsov, your response to that and the call?
Well, I wouldn't really pay too much emphasis on this call. First of all, neither Catherine Ashton nor Estonian minister have really investigated what happened in Ukraine at that period. And their views are their personal views. It's not based on evidence. It's not based on investigation. There were rumors during the Ukrainian revolution that there was a third force who was very much interested in escalation of the conflict. And maybe a representative of that third force was shooting at protesters and at police. So we must not exclude this possibility. And again, Ashton's and Estonian ministers' views are their own views, their subjective views, and are not based on the investigation.
Keith Gesson, I'd like to ask you about this whole issue of Crimea itself, because obviously it's at the center now of this conflict. And neither Russians nor Ukrainians have historical roots in Crimea. Could you talk about the history of that region and how it is that it became a majority Russian-speaking area?
Well, initially, going back to a few centuries, it was a Tatar region. So you have the Crimean Tatars who was there. There was a Khanate of the Tatars. It was colonized by Russia back in the early 18th century. So Russia has been there for a fairly long time. Then it was transferred into Ukraine in 1954 by Khrushchev. The Soviets drew these borders. They never really thought the Soviet Union was going to fall apart, so they didn't really care what went where. And now, of course, it's become a very problematic area. It's been, since the beginning of Ukrainian independence, Crimea has been the most restive, the most separatist, the area that has given the country the most problems.
Who are the protesters, Keith, overall? How would you characterize what's going on right now in Ukraine?
I think it's important to understand that there's been a lot of debate, especially on the left, about the presence of nationalists and ultra-right people in the protests. I think they're definitely there. They're in parliament. Leftist activists from Russia who go down to Kiev, they tell stories about being beaten up. It's been for a few years now a pretty tense situation. The trouble in Ukraine is there is no left. There isn't. It's not Greece. It's not Italy. There isn't a left movement that the protests could really express. So if you're a young person who is very oppositional, is anti-government, you're going to gravitate toward the right. There is no left. So the coalition of the protests was a coalition of liberals who want to be part of Europe, who don't really want to have too much to do with Russia, which has become a very ugly authoritarian regime, and these ultra-right, ultra-nationalists. And it was a coalition which you see, we saw this also in the Russian protests a couple of years ago against Putin. It was the same sort of coalition of the right wing and the liberals.
And Jonathan Steele, I'd like to ask you about the role of the United States and the European Union in this conflict. You've been urging the U.S. to back off in some of your writings. Could you speak about that particular role, the United States' role here?
Well, I think it goes back to the expansion of NATO after the fall of the Soviet Union, which a lot of people, former Russian ambassadors of the West, of U.S., like Jack Matlock and people in Britain who'd served in Moscow realized would be a damaging move. And there was a bit of an argument, I think, over whether or not to expand NATO. But the hawks won out in the Clinton administration. So Poland and Hungary were brought in, and then became the former Soviet republics, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And then there's always been the idea in NATO that they could expand even further to Georgia particularly, and Ukraine. And Ukraine is so strategically important to Russia. One can understand why they feel very angry about that and upset. And this EU agreement that Yanukovych refused to sign would have been possibly a kind of backdoor towards NATO membership, because it does say that Ukraine would be part of the common security and foreign policy of the EU, which is, of course, linked to NATO as well. So I can understand why the Russians were very unhappy about that. And they liked Yanukovych because he was the first president out of the four they've had since independence who, in his election campaign, said, we will not join NATO. And he was elected partly on that basis, because all opinion polls have shown the majority of Ukrainians are against NATO membership. But then in the more recent events of the last few days, I think Kerry and Obama have overreacted, because they should recognize, as I said before, that this is a very dubious government in Kiev, and whether or not it's constitutional or not can be argued, but it's certainly not popular to people in the East, the Russian-speaking majority of the country in the East and the South. And they should try and get a more democratic government. But instead of that, Kerry just ignores that, and he's been pressing Lavrov in the two meetings they've held this week in Paris and in Rome to recognize, as he put it, the legitimacy of the government in Ukraine. Well, that's That should be a matter for discussion and negotiation, not something that they just say to the Russians, basically, you have to accept this government, come what may. And that's where the West at the moment is making a huge mistake.
On Monday, former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations John Bolton appeared on Fox News. He said Putin's trying to expand Russia's territory in the region.
He gave us notice of his strategy 7 or 8 years ago when he said, in what is now one of the most frequently repeated quotes from his leadership in Russia, when he said the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. It's clear he wants to reestablish Russian hegemony within the space of the former Soviet Union. Ukraine is the biggest prize. That's what he's after. The occupation of the Crimea is a step in that direction. It shows now how Putin will negotiate with the interim government in Kiev. He'll negotiate with it with his foot on Ukraine's neck.
Jonathan Steele, do you think that's a fair assessment? And then I want to get Anton's response.
No, I think that's a gross overreaction and exaggeration. Putin is trying to set up something called the Eurasian Union, a kind of customs union, and he's got Belarus and Kazakhstan to show interest in that, and he wanted Ukraine to join too. But I mean, the real problem is that Ukraine is divided between people who are Russian-speaking in the east and the western side, which is part of it, which was never even under the Tsarist Empire of Russia. So it's a very divided country. You have to have perhaps eventually a federation to prevent it breaking apart. But in the meantime, a proper national government of national unity. And I see no sense that this crisis has been created by Putin. He's reacting to events, and one has to look at those events and not assume he's on some forward march. We heard all this in the Soviet period, that the Russians were always on the expansionist march and so on. I mean, you have to look at the facts and not just fit them into some kind of ideological anti-Russian sort of matrix.
Anton Shekatsov, would you agree?
No, I don't agree with Mr. Steele. Well, first of all, this is the interim government. This is the first post-revolutionary government, and it is very important to understand that in May, Ukrainians will have presidential elections, and shortly after that, perhaps in autumn, Ukrainians will have early parliamentary elections in order to renew the legitimacy of the power relations in Ukraine. As for Putin and his expansionist ideas, they're very clear that Putin is not going to stop with occupying Crimea. He will go further. Putin himself may be a strategist or still holding those KGB views, but the ideology behind Putin and his advisors is called Eurasianism. And Eurasianism is about not only restoring the Soviet Union in its former borders, but going beyond that. And if you know Russian history, if you know contemporary Russian politics, you will see that his advisors, they are urging him to go westwards and not only defend Russian-speaking population in the Crimea. And I'm myself ethnic Russian. I'm myself Russian-speaking. I had to learn Ukrainian to speak it. I opposed Russian invasion in the Crimea. Maybe then he will try to defend Russian-speaking in the Baltics, and there are around 1 million of them living in Lithuania, Estonia and Latvia, and maybe then he could go even further. Putin is now destroying the whole security system of post-war Europe. He's challenging the West, and he's trying to undermine all the attempts at nuclear disarmament, because in 1994 Ukraine voluntarily got rid of the world's third largest stock of nuclear weapons, and Ukraine was promised territorial integrity and sovereignty by Russia, the US and UK, and now Russia violated that agreement. And then the situation in the world, if the West fails to protect Ukraine and protect its territorial integrity, then a nuclear weapon, a nuclear bomb, will be the only tool and instrument for protecting territorial integrity and sovereignty in the whole world. And a new nuclear arms race will commence, and that would be a horrible, horrible development. That would put the whole world in danger.
Well, I want to raise the issue of the European Union role. And Keith Kessler, maybe you can respond to this. On Thursday, European Union leaders agreed to suspend visa and investment talks with Russia. European Council President Herman Van Rompuy told a news conference that the EU leaders would also freeze Russian assets and withdraw from a G8 summit if Russia does not back down.
In the absence of results, the European Union will decide on additional measures such as travel bans, asset freezes, and the cancellation of the EU-Russia summit. Any further steps by the Russian Federation to destabilize the situation in Ukraine would lead to severe and far-reaching consequences for relations between the European Union and its member states on the one hand and the Russian Federation on the other hand, which will include a broad range of economic areas.
That was European Council President Herman Van Rompuy. But the reality is that Europe is very, very reliant on Russia for much of its natural gas and other resources. Could you talk about the gamble here being played between the European Union and Russia as well?
Well, I mean, I would also say that, that gas goes through Ukraine. One of the largest companies in Ukraine is Naftogaz, which takes care of the pipeline that takes the gas from Europe into Russia. So everybody is sort of tied together in these knots that are going to be very difficult to untie. I think one of the things that gets lost in these discussions of the standoff between Russia and the EU and the US and Russia is Ukraine. Right? Ukraine is being turned into a battleground for the aspirations, on the one hand, of the EU and on the other hand of Russia. This is not good for Ukraine. And part of the problem is this, this process started in 2004 with the Orange Revolution, which brought to the government, to the presidency, Viktor Yushchenko, who was strongly nationalist, also very strongly anti-Russian. He had a very anti-Russian presidency. Relations between the two countries were very bad. And part of the reason that Yanukovych was legitimately elected in 2010 was that people were very tired of this standoff with Russia. It wasn't good for Ukraine. A lot of people have family ties to Russia. And economically and culturally and historically, Ukraine is tied to Russia. However, the Russian regime is terrible. It's really awful. It is less democratic by a pretty wide margin than the Ukrainian regime. So you have the situation where Ukraine has this natural ally and natural neighbor. Unfortunately, that natural ally and natural neighbor is Russia.
Just to wrap up, Anton Shekatsov and then Jonathan Steele, finally, what do you think needs to happen now?
I would really support all the efforts that the U.S. under leadership of President Barack Obama and the EU are doing right now. Nobody wants a war, so I think that the West should act firmly, but try all the diplomatic measures possible, including, of course, political, economic, military, but without any military conflict. Introduce some sanctions like visa bans and investigations about the money laundering in the West by the Russian oligarchs. So the more diplomatic measures are introduced, the better. So I think that Russia, it is already suffering economically, and I don't think that people in Russia, Russian citizens, will be really interested in a situation when their economy declines.
Jonathan Steele, your
so
final.
I think,
since we're going to have to wrap, your final comment.
there has to be agreement between the West and Moscow on this. I think they should try and find a common economic package in which both sides contribute, because the economy is really the major problem facing Ukraine. I think Putin will back off on Crimea if he feels he's got reassurances, for example, that there will be no issue of joining either the Eurasian Union, the Moscow-led Union, or the EU, the Western-led Union, for the time being, that's all put on ice, and the character of the government in Kiev is enlarged and broadened to reassure people in eastern and southern Ukraine that they're not going to be humiliated and discriminated against in future. So negotiations is the way out. Compromise is the way out.
I want to thank you all for being with us. Jonathan Steele, former Moscow correspondent for The Guardian. Anton Shekottsov is a Ukrainian citizen with the University College London. Keith Gasson, editor at N+1 Mag.